Welcome, everyone, to the Inclusion Podcast. I'm Dr. Julie Costin.
And I'm Dr. Christy Preddy-Franzak. We're so glad you're here as we explore all things inclusion.
So whether you're a school leader, an educator, a parent, or simply passionate about inclusion, this podcast is for you.
In each episode, we go beyond the usual conversations, diving into what truly makes inclusive education work.
Together, let's make a difference, one conversation at a time. Here we go. Welcome to the Inclusion Podcast, episode 33. Today, we're answering a very unique question that comes often when school systems become more and more inclusive. And the question that we're answering today is, how do we explain to families that moving toward more inclusive services isn't about reducing support, but instead about enhancing their child's educational experience?
So this one, Julie describes it as unique because it's kind of a niche question and it can mean something very different for different families. It's not unique in the sense that it comes up all the time.
It does come up all the time. And families have been educated in the past when special ed services looked like a self-contained classroom or a resource room. And so one of the things that we know is that when schools become more inclusive, we often spend months preparing educators, administrators to understand why we're moving in a more inclusive direction. And then when it's time to change things up for families, they're left in the dust. They don't understand why we're moving in this direction. They assume maybe it's about budget cuts or something, when in reality, we're getting much closer to the spirit of the law. And we're getting services that are going to be better for their children in so many ways, but we have to communicate that to families.
Well, Julie, I think what you're hinting at is this underlying wondering / concern / fear that services are going to be cut or placement is going to be changed in a way that is not going to meet their child's needs. I'll give a quick example. Years ago, a mom that I was working with had a preschooler with autism, and she went to an IEP meeting. And when she came home, now this is old school, the phone was still on the wall. So that tells you how old it was, right? Yeah. And her phone kept ringing. I was there on a home visit and I thought, what's going on? She keeps getting all these calls. Well, other families knew that she had an IEP meeting that day, and they wanted to make sure that she did not cave to the school district. And because if one says, no, we don't need extended school year, or if one family says, no, it's fine, we don't need speech therapy, or in this case, we don't need, something for a kid with autism, then all families are at risk. So that showed me that there was this kind of peer pressure, if you will, to keep status quo because so many families had fought hard for this particular status quo. And we've sort of told them, more therapy is better or more hours is better, So it's not only that we haven't brought families along, we've sort of told them a whole other story.
Yeah. I like to say we've sold them a whole bill of goods. We've said to them, this is better for your child, separate, specialized, unique, individualized. Over here, don't you worry, this is best for your kid. When in reality, we know that actually inclusive education is much better for students academically, behaviorally, socially, etc. And we have to start telling families that story in a specific and clear and mindful way. And so Christy and I put together a handout for you that goes along with this podcast, and it's about 20 different talking points that you can use to share the benefits of inclusive education. And we have other resources too, if you're interested, but we'll start here with these.
Yeah, so in the show notes, I'll put several resources, but let's start with how to get the download. So in case you want to follow along, you can go to inclusiveschooling.com/download33, and you will get these 20 talking points for really answering this question for families. And you're going to notice several themes, but let's first start with kind of what the talking points are backed by, Julie, and then we'll talk about how those themes emerged from and why these 20 kind of percolated to the top.
Yeah, so they're all based on the legal rights of children with disabilities that would be outlined in IDEA under FAPE, free appropriate public education, and under least restrictive environment. So if you're making an umbrella drawing of this, you'd say there's IDEA, and under that there's FAPE, free appropriate public education, and then under that there's least restrictive environment. And all those aspects in the federal law need to be met. And so what will be helping families understand is this move towards more inclusive education is getting us in alignment with the spirit of federal law. Most school districts are out of alignment. They're not in alignment with the spirit of the federal law around least restrictive environment. And the goal is to get more and more kids into more inclusive settings and placements.
So like here's an example. The very first statement or talking point in the download is inclusive education aligns with your child's legal rights under IDEA and ensures they receive a free and appropriate public education. So let's break down the jargon, if you will. IDEA is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Improvement Act of 2004 at the time of this podcast episode. And then Julie mentioned FAPE, free and appropriate public education. So we're just reiterating to families that inclusion or inclusive education is in alignment with IDEA and FAPE. It does by way of least restrictive environment. And you can catch other of our inclusion podcast episodes to break down what is the least restrictive environment. What do we do about a continuum of services? We answer those questions in other podcast episodes. But for now, just know that a lot of the statements that we will invite you to use during IEP meetings or parent-teacher conferences or in a text message with a family that has a concern is grounded, in, at least in the United States, in the federal law or IDEA 2004.
Okay. The next big area that you'll find encompasses a lot of these big ideas is the concept of general education. And how general education has been defined in case law is that it's content, curriculum, and peers, meaning kids with disabilities should be in places and spaces that have general education content, general education curriculum, and general education peers. And so when you think about a third grade level, that's happening in a third grade classroom. When you think about seventh grade, that's happening in a seventh grade English classroom. It's not happening in a resource classroom. So it helps you to get really clear when we say, what's a general ed placement? Is there general education content, general education curriculum, and general education peers? And peers has also been defined to say not just one kid without a disability in a classroom. It's of this natural proportions concept, meaning that if 12% of your school system are kids with disabilities, then you really want about 12% of any classroom to have kids with disabilities in it. So that's another aspect of what is a general education classroom.
And just keep in mind, as Julie said, that case law really defines what is general education. Federal law doesn't. The only thing it really mentions is that it's anything curricular or extracurricular that a student without a disability has access to, can participate in, and is expected to make progress towards. So it's really just saying anything that a school offers and does is something that a student with a disability has equal opportunity to be included in. And then we know from the research, they then benefit. Let's go to the third topic, Julie, because this is one where you can then give a couple more examples from the handout about specially designed instruction or individualized support or how we're going to provide adaptations.
So a lot of times when families hear, okay, so my child is going to be now placed back in a general ed setting, they go, oh no, how are their services going to be met? How are their needs going to be met? How are their minutes going to be met? And what people have to understand is this is the art of inclusive education. It is in providing all kinds of individualized supports to kids right where they are, right when they need it, right at the time. So this individualized piece you'll see in many, many different places of these talking points.
Yeah, my favorite, Julie, like try number 3, 4, or 5, that from the download, which again is at inclusiveschooling.com/download 33. And you'll see this theme come up in the talking points Julie shares.
Yeah, I'll start with 5. Your child will have the same opportunities to participate in all classroom activities, which will really promote a sense of belonging. The third one is we will integrate specialized instruction within the general education classroom to provide the supports your child needs. Of course, our job as educators is to explain what does that look like for your child, right? It's not just to say, trust us, we're doing it. That's where the IEP comes in, where you say, this is how we're going to meet their needs in the general ed setting through these adaptations, these supports, these specific instructional techniques.
Yeah. In fact, sometimes Julie and I say, we shouldn't just say, oh, your child be included, or we're moving towards inclusive education. We need to say inclusion with supports, because it does mean that the team will have to work to figure out how to adapt things, when to provide modifications, how to differentiate, when to offer choice, all of the notions that come with an individualized education plan.
That's right. So those 3 themes of legal rights, general education, and individualization all come through in these 20 talking points. Again, these talking points are really good for school administrators or educators that are trying to explain to families why we're moving towards inclusion with supports. The last thing I want to mention is in the show notes, we're going to put an article that we wrote for the Peel Center, and it's for families. And it's an article that is really directed right to families to say, how do I help get my kid in an inclusive setting? And in that article, we have the legal aspects of it, we have the research aspects of inclusive education, and then we have strategies for families to use to help create inclusive education. Because many families are excited about the idea, and some families are concerned about the idea. So those will also be in the show notes for you to take and download and share with your families.
Yeah, and Julie has a really great idea often when sharing that article, is to maybe do it like a book study or do it in pieces and parts. There's 5 strategies, and you might need to break down each one because it can be pretty meaty in the sense of referencing to case law, talking about research, talking about what to expect in the classroom in terms of inclusive practices. So you might need to get it translated. You might need to break it down and have conversations. But this is all the things that we'll put in the show notes, as well as you can get today's download with the 20 talking points that are based upon these themes that all address the question that families are going to have about, if we're moving towards inclusive services, are we actually reducing the supports that my student needs? And you can get those talking points at inclusiveschooling.com/download33.
Thank you for tuning in, and don't forget to subscribe and catch up on past episodes where we share valuable insights, straight talk, and practical steps to challenge outdated special education practices. You can find every episode with the show notes at inclusiveschooling.com/inclusion-podcast to build more inclusive schools together.